Imagine you're a soldier stationed in a country recovering from economic collapse or war. You're far from home, and you're facing a crowd of people angry who may not want you there. You have to respond, or you fear for your life and the life of the people surrounding you. Instead of being armed with a conventional firearm, you're armed with a device that is designed to incapacitate, but it causes pain, lots of pain. With one flick of a switch, a beam shoots out and passes over the crowd, and you watch as faces change from anger to pain to fear, and they run away. This is not a prediction of a dystopian future. This is technology that currently exists and could be used tomorrow. And it's the kind of technology that I like to talk about when I go over non-lethal weapons, as it dispels some of the myths and rumors around the technology. We currently live in a world where the international community is moving away from war as an acceptable means of state response, and where active measures are in place to protect civilians in conflict zones through the introduction of peacekeeping missions. And I believe this is a good thing. However, we also have to have a strong discussion about the topic of pain weapons in society. And over the last 1.5 to 2 years that I've been researching this, I've come up with a question, and a big one that I think needs to be answered, discussed. And that's, at what point is inflicting pain for control purposes unethical? And hopefully at the end of this speech, you'll agree with me when I say that we need to have a robust discussion about the role of pain weapons in society. Before I go on, there's probably a couple things I should hit first, and some of them you might be thinking right now of, why is this important? Why should we be discussing this? It seems like a very niche issue. And I'll answer that later on in my speech, but also know that this has roots in day-to-day lives, not for most of us, but for some. And secondly, what do I mean when I talk about non-lethal weapons or pain weapons? And so, for the most part, I'm going to be referring them to non-lethal weapons, and that is any weapon designed specifically to incapacitate rather than to kill. And so, as you might imagine, that's a pretty wide category. It's everything from riot batons, to tear gas, to lasers that temporarily blind, to weapons that would take me hours to explain. But most of you may be familiar with probably the most prevalent kind, which is that of the taser. So if you look on the hip of most RCMP officers, it's a little yellow device. And I believe most of you probably know how they work, but I'll describe it really quickly just in case. So the taser works by using an electrical current to cause muscle spasms, and essentially people fall down once it's used. And it was intentionally designed to protect both the target and the person using it, so the police officer or the service personnel. So it's a safe means of dealing and perhaps de-escalating conflict. Once the current stops, so does the pain. And when we look at the United States and Canada, for example, we can see that there is effectiveness within this rollout. In cases done, in some areas, there's up to a 64% decrease in the use of lethal force when tasers are implemented, which is a good thing, right? What it means is less people are dying because fewer rounds are being shot from rifles or pistols. However, we're also seeing a decrease in the use of soft control. And so what soft control is where the officer or the service personnel puts their hands on the intended target. So where they tackle them to the ground or they just hold them in place. And so what this seems to indicate is that police officers, in this example, are more comfortable using tasers, so escalating to that point rather than maybe using de-escalation tactics or holding the suspect down. There's also some other things to consider when we're talking about the uses of non-lethal weapons. And there's been some interesting stuff done on warfare and kind of the idea of firing at another human being. And so the preposition in that is that human beings do not want to fire at other human beings. So for example, when we look at World War II, studies were done where the amount of rounds expended versus rounds hit was way off. So people shot way more than people were hit. And so what the takeaway from this is that human beings either intentionally or unconsciously fire above their targets. And so after World War II, studies were commissioned. The academic legitimacy of these have been questioned, so we know the effect, we don't know why. But after World War II, targets were switched from circles to silhouettes. So by the Vietnam War in the US Army, that number of rounds expended to rounds hit dropped, so it equalized. So you had to train the human to ignore their unconscious biases to actually fire at another human being. So you may be asking yourself, why is this relevant to non-lethal weapons? And so the bridge here is that if you've ever seen a protest video, either from peacekeepers, whether it be Haiti or elsewhere, or riot situations, you'll see that officers are deploying these rounds quickly and indiscriminately. So when you're looking at rubber bullets, you see they fly out of the gun pretty fast. The argument here is that when you equip soldiers or police officers with non-lethal weapons, they know that these rounds are less likely to kill. And so to protect themselves, they're more likely to use them. So we need to be talking about this in terms of an ethical thing of if we give more non-lethal weapons, we may, and this is a may, as we don't have definitive proof, also be encouraging their use more. And as we look at more advanced forms of non-lethal weapons, there are also some concerns that we need to address in terms of ethics. We're creating new and more efficient means of targeting biological weaknesses that we all share as humans. And so that allows for better ways and less painful ways of addressing violence. But there are also some huge drawbacks as well. And the device that I use to highlight this is something called the active denial system. What it is it's a dish mounted on a truck, which is attached to a big battery. And it shoots a ray out, and it heats the water molecules of your skin about 2 millimeters deep, so it's safe, to close to a boiling point. And so it simulates the fact that you're on fire. So it causes lots of pain. If the ray sweeps over you once, you're fine. The minute the ray passes over you, there's no permanent damage, there's no lasting injury. However, if the ray sweeps over you 2, 3, or more times, then you may be looking at the possibility of 2nd to 3rd degree burns over a large percentage of your body. So if this system sounds familiar, it's because it's the one I opened up the talk with. It is worth mentioning that the ADS has never seen deployment. Some might argue that it's still better than firing bullets at people, right? The chance of killing someone is still decreased when we use the system. But I would argue strongly, in terms of ethics, that if we're okay with deploying the system, something is wrong. The reason that we haven't seen this deployed is not from an ethical concerns situation, it's from a technical one. It takes 24 hours for that battery to spool up. The US Department of Defense, the Israeli Defense Force, as well as other agencies are looking at miniaturizing this technology and putting it in the hands of individual personnel. And so this is where things start to become very gray for me, where we need to start talking about, is this acceptable to us as a society? Are we okay with doing this? And then the question that comes after that is, first of all, is it ethical to use pain for compliance purposes? And 2, with this technology, at what point then does it become more ethical to kill them? So we need to be talking about things like this. And this isn't a situation where we can sit back, think, wait a while. This new technology is coming out quickly. For example, let me jump back to the taser. We now have systems that, instead of being contained in a little gun on the hip, are deployed by shotgun shell. So it's safe and everything is contained. But instead of having a range of 1 meter, you're looking at a range of 20. The Indian Army is looking at weaponizing the ghost pepper through the form of tear gas. And so we're reaching a point where as we advance new technologies, these aren't being considered. There is a shocking lack of discussion internationally and locally on what is acceptable and where do we find the line to be. And so that's something that I thought we definitely needed to discuss. And let's talk about the issues that come with the use of non-lethal weapons. For example, when we're talking about blunt force trauma weapons, so rubber bullets, batons, things like that, there is a lethality in there. For rubber bullets, generally anything within 10 meters can be lethal. For batons, which are used in riot situations, any hit to the head or chest is technically counted as a lethal attack. For the taser, while they are mostly safe, the issue is if you have a congenital heart defect or other types of situations like that, the taser can be lethal. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over the last decade, 10 children have been killed and 1,500 injured by the Israeli Defense Forces' use of non-lethal weapons. And I don't highlight this to call them out for that. I can think of no better situation for the need for non-lethal weapons, as well as simultaneously showing the problems that we currently have with this generation of tools. And, excuse me, at a certain point, we need to have this discussion to, one, bolster academic discussion, as well as our own. I spent a year and a half on my undergraduate thesis doing research on this. And it was shocking that in that year and a half, I found not one academic work on non-lethal weapons in peacekeeping. This discussion is absent. And these are tools that can be very helpful. Right now, we are sending ill-equipped and ill-trained troops into conflict zones to do the job of diplomats. And all we're giving them is a rifle and a baton. It's not working. And perhaps we can design non-lethal weapons to better fill those gaps. But there are some problems with that. Currently, under international law, several types of non-lethal weapons are banned from service. For example, tear gas. It's used in riot control situations to break up large crowds. But under the Geneva Convention, it is considered chemical warfare and banned. The same thing for suppressant foam designed to stop movement. So these are tools that could really help commanders de-escalate a situation, but they can't use them. Meanwhile, it is perfectly legal to fire a spinning bullet out of a rifle designed to maim. We need to be pushing for a discussion on this, for a talk on this. Ultimately, I'm not here today to argue for a blanket ban or support for non-lethal weapons. Personally, from my research that I've done, I believe that they are an incredibly important and invaluable tool in supporting the needs of both police officers and servicemen for peacekeeping missions. But that doesn't mean I don't have a lot of concerns with this technology. And that's just technology in general. Take, for example, in our day-to-day lives. Whenever one piece of new technology comes in, 10 to 15 will soon spring up. Take, for example, drones. Once one entered the commercial market, 15 to 20 competitors soon sprung up, and now we have an entire marketplace designed to drones. Same thing happens with non-lethal weaponry. We're constantly building the next generation. And if we're not talking about them now, by the time we implement them, it'll be too late. So we have a decision ahead of us. We can either wait for experts to tell us what is right and wrong, or we can actually be active, present, and at the table for these decisions and decide as a society what we deem as acceptable. And I can't think of any other I can't think of any other way to do this. Thank you for your time.